So, welcome to our last panel. This is the end of 2.5 very intense days. I'd like to welcome you to this final panel. This is the final final session of our symposium. So we have 1 more hour left. What are we going to do in this hour? First of all, we are going to talk the 4 conference observers in order to tell us about their observations from an exterior and external perspective. Then I'm going to reply, and I will also mention the answers that were given in the chat, answers to the question that we asked you. And then Kerstin GOTHE will finish. She will give another statement from her perspective and give us some information. And of course, thank everybody involved. And it will end as it has begun, with bells. So what is a symposium? What have we been doing? Symposium, in the original Greek, it means a banquet or a drinking event. Symphinein was the original Greek root, to drink together. So this meant, well, we've had a lot to eat together, we have had much to drink, and if you have a headache and you feel slightly full, then I believe this is the result of this conference. That's probably normal. So we can help you digest. And this is the mandate of the conference observers. And of course, you can still use the platform, the online platform, until the end of February. So we have the conference observers. We have invited them to observe what we've been discussing and to give us a feedback at the end. They come from countries which were not so much in the focus of this conference, and we did this on purpose. We wanted to have an external perspective. I would like to introduce SIGURD BERGMAN from Norway and Anne FORNEROD from France. And we also wanted to have ARTO KUORIKOSKI from Finland, as well as STUREIKA from Belarus. SIGURD BERGMAN, may I like to ask you to start, please? Yes, thank you very much. I'm from Sweden, not from Norway. So.
I will move on and talk English as there are many international guests also. My points are structured in 4 points. That is about the reflexive, the ecological, the social, and the political. And I will in all parts talk a little bit of what for me was important, what I lacked, and as the conveners asked us to make suggestions for the future also. So to begin with, reflexive, or better, the transdisciplinarity of the whole field, which is very important for me. It was so exciting and wonderful to see how many different disciplines, methods, theories, and skills are in synergy in this field. And in the theme, there is so many approaches, sociology of religion, church history, liturgy, theology, architecture, art history, history, space studies, urban planning, landscape planning, arts, aesthetics, cultural heritage, philosophy, ethics, and so on and so on. But there is, in fact, no real overarching discourse about the theoretical implications of this transdisciplinarity activity. I would like to make a plea also for some kind of a meta discourse. Do not misunderstand me. I'm not arguing for a normative narrative that dogmatically has to govern everything. And there are already so many pieces for such a theoretical, as reflecting the synergy of transdisciplinarity approaches. There's Paul Post's ritual studies, there's Albert Gerhard's Raumsoziologie with regard to sacred space. There are pieces from urban planning. Jörg Beste showed a graph about the actor scheme, so-called stakeholders, and Edith Wouters just the morning presented a very interesting, what I would call geographies of the sacred, where a church never is alone, but a part of a geographical, cultural, historical context. It has to be embedded. And already the conveners designed for the conference by grouping all this is in fact an exploration of the multi-diversity of different approaches and tools. So let's try also not to have a meta discourses on the top of all, but following and monitoring what's happening in the transdisciplinary process here. The second point about the ecological, here I really lack much more environmental reflection about the ecological dimensions. There have been, of course, some pieces, but it's not only about what kind of a heating system, what energy use, the green surroundings. And I have not seen any creation theology either. But sacred spaces and every individual church, but the whole of the sacred space geography are in fact parts of what we could call a cosmic context. A church always refers to more than itself, to heaven, to earth, to the planet and Mother Earth, if you want. And I think one should much more deepen and develop this dimension in the future. In every building, light, of course, the spatial atmosphere, the nature inside, outside, the wonderful bees in Dörler's slides recently. And there is the opening and the flow in between the inner and the out, the Jewish synagogue, who is more hiding, the Melanchthon Church in Hanover, my birth town, which opens up by glass. What I had expected in this conference were also projects where a church is turned into a ruin, but I only saw one example for this in Edith Wouters. If you turning a place into a ruin is not a demolition immediately, but it can be turned into a memorial place, and especially if you highlight the gardening, the landscape architecture of a church historical ruin, you can do lots of exciting things. And my favorite project here is again in Hanover, in the old city, one of the three larger pieces, the St. Egidian church in the midst of the city, where the roof is gone away as a consequence of the Second World War, and where the church is both opened and closed space. It can be used for rituals, but it's also an artistic place, and it is offering a very specific atmosphere and a zone of both contemplation, reflection, experiences in the midst of the city. Mainly dependent on the lack of its roof, but anyway, there is the same thing in Norway, in Hamar, the old cathedral of one of the oldest dioceses, which is then surrounded by glass and so on. There are examples how a ruin is not just the end and the demolition of a church. It can be a new start or a new use of a sacred space. My third point, the social, also there has been said so much wonderful differentiated already, so I don't need to say so much about it. Again, a church building is never ever only a church. It is also a materialization of a social process. And what Johannes earlier said, that every reuse needs processes. Every establishment of a church is already a fruit of a social processes. And it is for me very important. I'm just a part of an evaluation a process of a dissertation in Danish, Aarhus or Northern Jylland, where the community, the city of Aarhus itself, paid for the whole dissertation project at the faculty and the section for practical theology, where everyone who has a relation and an interest in a church and a sacred space should be involved also in this process. And you have already so wonderful many examples, so that's done. Finally, the fourth point, the political. I would just like to encourage, don't be afraid of politics. Don't be afraid of designing and developing the reused or multi-used or expanded uses of church places, also as political statements and political critical places who manifest a vision of another way of life, the great transformation, as Ulrich Schneiderwind has called it in his wonderful book, where we need a transformation also due to climate change and other. Pandemic can learn us lots of things about this different transformed society where we want to live. If you remember the GDR, the whole non-violence movement, who finally led to the breakdown of the regime, were gathering in the free spaces of the churches. That was the only place where one could gather and have some kind of embroidery of resistance. There are so many diaconia activities, and buildings are always about shelter. That is the main central issue in all architecture, to offer shelter. So houseless people, refugees, need shelters, but also the ordinary citizen who feels alone, or need to make friends, or to visit some place where also other people can be encountered in the corona quarantines. There are so many political critical functions which you can develop in the design of reused churches. So for me, a church always is a place where the love to God manifests as the love to the neighbor, and the love to the stranger, and the love to oneself is embedded in this love to the neighbor. So the historical is also always some kind of a countervailing power to the ongoing destructive powers of the day. In Petra Potts' session, there were wonderful examples for this. And if I say in general, I lack theology, it's really surprising that there are so few theological arguments or perspectives. It was only in Christoph Sigrid's examples from the church tower, including the blowing the horn. And this was mainly about ethics, but it was theologically founded. And not the bishop yesterday evening in the panel either had much theology to offer. But there are still theologians present also at this conference. Maybe it is healthy that we start with practice and practices and processes and so on, and take it easy with theology, that can be quite destructive also sometimes. But contextual theology, which is spatialized and spatially conscious, is really a strong force, which we also need to activate. So I will just end with regard to Paul Post's central term of the sacred. And someone asked, what do you mean by the sacred? And he said, well, this and that, there are theories and so. For me, it's very simple. Sacred is what people regard as sacred. So if a church building can be the place where we negotiate and exchange and manifest and materialize spatially what we regard as sacred. Then it's done, and that can be done in many different ways, from religious denominations and from secular traditions, whatever. Thank you.
Now I would like to ask Anne FORNEROD from Strasbourg.
Thank you, Johannes. But you know, I advertised the conference, but anyway. So we were supposed to address 3 points in our presentation. And regarding the first one, the conference addressed several key questions which are closely intertwined, actually. And there is, in my view, the how question. And in addition to the key process planning session, it seems that the various presentations have constantly gone beyond the singularity of each case to achieve a more systematic approach or to draw more general lessons from these cases. And all the contributions revolved around this idea that a process is at the heart of any thinking on church reuse or repurposing, remodeling, recasting. And it turned out perhaps to be eventually the process symposium. Still about the how question, the fate of churches amounts to solving a very complex equation and calls for multidisciplinarity. And in my view, this should include the religious approach in the first place, with all that it encompasses, whether to reflect on sacrality, sacred space, the theological implications, sometimes struggle of power, or the trace that may be left from the building as heritage. This, I think, was an important insight of the conference, and it has very much to do with the who question. Who should be involved and when, and who is legitimate to have a say? Regarding the when question, it is striking to see the amount of time it often takes to make a decision, even if this decision is to demolish a church. And it might be a years-long process. Time is an issue. And in this regard, it might be useful to look at the question of the starting point of reuse processes to avoid the no way back situations. And then there is the what question. Of course, it is about church buildings, but it is more than that. Here, the conference offered various examples of connections between the inside and the outside looks a church reuse calls upon. This link between the church and the outside environment can be created through the activities it hosts, an openness to social, cultural environment, fresh expressions of church, or even through sound. About the what question, the fate of movable goods might perhaps be a point to further consider. And we saw recently this morning how chairs, simple chairs, can be part of a process. And this leads me to the next point, which will be much shorter, the aspects I missed. Considering my background in law, I could have missed this approach, but I did not actually. I'm convinced that the legal parameter, like money, does not come first, although it sometimes stands in the way and remains, of course, an underlying issue. But the law should not prevail over the possibility of dialogue. It interferes mainly, if not exclusively, at the country level. And while this conference shows how European this issue of reuse of churches is, we share many things. I come to the third point, the future. In line with what I said at the beginning, this conference has been instrumental in identifying the main constraints on the churches whose future is at stake, but also the tools available along the various steps of what amount to a process. All this could be extended by a systematic survey of the processes or plans implemented here and there in order to identify the various parameters to be taken into consideration in a specific situation and to elaborate adapted scenarios. Because beyond cultural, legal, and historical particularities from one country to another, some common parameters clearly emerge. And this is very encouraging for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for this contribution from your side.
Okay. ARTO KUORIKOSKI from Finland. I think he has technical issues, but okay, so then it's your turn. Dear colleagues, I will speak a little bit of English and a little bit of German.
So we had these 3 questions, and my first observation concerning the conference is that instead of sticking to my opinion, pretty nonsensical catchword of every church is individual or somehow singular, or something that you cannot in any way classify or characterize. For this question, the Symposium brought out several positive, valuable distinction, especially concerning the reuse of churches. Sometimes one can notice that the singularity or particularity of the church is a kind of a pretext for not making any changes to the church, because it is as if it were as valuable and as singular as every human being. But also every human being can also be classified and are classified. For example, every doctor knows certain characteristics of a human being, and when you attend the doctor, because of his knowledge of a human being, he can also do changes and treat the maladies. The same is true of churches, which are, of course, sometimes also in need of a good doctor, which are the various stakeholders. Well, if I shortly bring out some main ideas how to characterize these churches, how to go forward from the singularity or simple particularity. I have noticed, for example, interesting things in Professor Stückelberg's 8 questions, and also in Jan Jasper's point, where he said that among other, the architectural possibilities are important. He said, can adjustments be made to the building to make it suitable for a secondary or reuse? This this wording, architectural possibilities, was very interesting. And then I need to notice also the Ardui and Sverker points. In the abstract, they told that they are carrying a systematic analysis. I was very delighted to read this, and then I noticed that concerning the in the work package 2, they say that they try to understand once again the characteristics of post-war churches in their research area, and like comparing means that there is not only some sort of singularity or particularity, but a possibility to see certain similarities, like location siting, typologies, spatial configuration, liturgical setting, materiality, and construction techniques. Of course, every building is like every human being, is a complex phenomenon, but it is just because of that fact that that seeing certain similarities might help other churches, other parishes to go on. So I go to the next chapter or question, which aspects you missed, and I have to say I wrote this yesterday, but I have to say almost the same things as SIGURD Bergman told us. And well, I don't know why I wrote this in German, but I can also translate. So
the theology of the building has not really been discussed, although it is extremely important.
So the theology was not discussed at all, in my opinion, only from some religious studies perspective. And I actually thought that concerning the Professor Stückelberg's 8 questions, the 9th would be very important to add, and this is exactly the question of the theology of the church building, because I don't know if it was sort of left off because there are people coming from several denominations or places where at least there are several denominations, but they intrinsically have a big how to say, influence. For example, those who come from the Reformation tradition see the church totally in another way than a Catholic, and we Lutherans are here in between. So coming to the third.
Yes, that's keep an eye on the time.
Yes, it's only one sentence.
30 seconds. Yes.
Yes, well, I know one. So a much detailed understanding of the theology of the church would be important in the future. That was my
okay.
Third.
Is there STSIAPAN, STUREIKA?
Yes, it's only one sentence.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, here you are. Welcome. It's your turn. Please speak only 5 minutes. It's important. Otherwise, we have problems here.
Thank you very much for inviting me to the symposium as an observer. It was really interesting to learn about these multiple issues of church conversion. I mean, the issues of architectural design, of urban planning, of heritage preservation, sociological and theological dimensions. I find some topics of particular interest also because here in Eastern Europe, we were facing quite opposite direction. I mean, opposite to secularization of society. After the collapse of Soviet Union in 90s, church communities came back to their churches, which were redesigned for and totally new purposes, but sometimes to cultural purposes, to museums, to palaces of culture, to cinema theaters, etc. And they faced, they said they faced quite opposite issues and problems, also dealing with heritage preservation, but vice versa. And learning today about German, Belgium, and sometimes Holland experience of church conversion is really interesting and useful. I miss a bit more religious perspectives, because most of our discussions during this symposium were devoted to Christian churches, but in again, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, there is a huge problem of abandoned synagogues and abandoned, mainly synagogues. But it's a real problem, and I think this could be could become another direction for the new conference. That's probably it from my side.
Thank you so much, STSIAPAN STUREIKA, from the perspective of Belarus or the Eastern Europe.
All right, we'll come to the second part of this last panel. Now I would like to read to you a bit of feedback from the chat, based on the chat of the homepage of the welcome site of the conference. Let's come to the first question. The first question that we asked on the homepage: what is your takeaway from this conference? So let me present you a couple of voices from the chat, some replies we received. As I said at the beginning, this is in order to ask you as participants and to involve you in this feedback and the evaluation of this conference, because for a large part, you are specialists in your field. And of course, you should be given the opportunity to tell us what you think. So the takeaway: somebody has learned that it was really impressive and encouraging to have all these efforts, the manifold efforts for church reusers to find appropriate solutions. This is good for all actors and stakeholders and should be published once more and again and again. Also to sensitize people, raise an awareness for church buildings built after 1960 as a problem for the whole of society. This should be taken into society out of just the specialist circles. So this goes back to the question of reuse as a social question. Somebody else said the churches should have more awareness that there's also a public interest in their church buildings. That was in the focus of this conference. They should enable an involvement of others, of members of the public. Somebody raised another question.
The huge variety, cultural, political, societal, the differences and approaches regarding the subject throughout Europe, it was impressioning. An anderer Punkt, there is even more possible in reusing churches compared with projects realized in the past in different countries. The common sense to find solutions for our church is an enormous task in the different, isn't it? An enormous task in the different countries in the coming years.
Let me jump to something else. The answers we received regarding the second question, anything that was missing for you? The conference observers have already told us their perspective. Maybe the church voices were a bit lacking, and also the theological background. And I believe this is something which can also be seen in the chat replies, that you wanted to see more of a theological perspective. Yes, well, maybe I can't read all of this. Again, once more, you wanted to have more feedback on my representatives of the churches. The high importance of the monument conservation could have been emphasized more. And why didn't you talk more about the inventory, the furniture inside the church? It was a great conference, but the perspective may be a bit bleak of the owners, because in practice many ideas cannot be implemented because the congregations don't want to be messed with, and so some things just can't be realized, and a demolition or a sale is just easier for them to do. It would be great if from the singular separate perspectives you have a best practice and a worst practice that you can develop, and you can maybe deepen this in other conferences in the future, maybe with specific work groups, for example, regarding projects and interest groups, from the strategy development until the realization and the implementation. There was one more thing regarding what was missing from your perspective.
We have missed out the social part, which is so important. You did the best out of the. Das ist eine Bemerkung. You did the best out of the situation, and I'm happy that I participated.
Of course, this is regarding this digital format that we are doing everything online. Yes, many people have mentioned that. Well, there was also a lot of positive feedback that this was possible in a digital framework, and that this is actually working quite well in this digital format instead of a real life conference. Well, let me come to the third question we asked. Any other ideas of feedback? Well, usually there's a lot of happy voices. We are commended for these conferences, for the very interesting presentations, the hosts, and the professional organization backstage. And people say that they are very much interested in continuing this exchange. Somebody says it would be really helpful if the presentations had web links and And the recommendations for books could still be on the website for a while, so we can look that up and we can download that. That is given, that will be the case. Everything we have will be put on that site. And even during this conference, we have uploaded the various presentations. I can just repeat this. You will find it on the website under program. I hope very much, and I would wish that this international discussion with this challenge, that this will be continued in the future. So it would be great also to include the media and give them some information too. And in my view, it needs, in the midterm, it needs something like a National Heritage Trust, which is able to act and can accompany projects and support and facilitate them. That was the idea of this conference, that you come together from other ways of organization and you learn from other countries maybe what they do differently, because this results in the insights that we have learned from this sharing of experiences.
I will end with this atmospheric picture overview. I thank everybody who contributed in the chat. Of course, we could not tell you everything that was said. This chat on the welcome page will be available until the end of February. So you can continue to give feedback there and provide specific suggestions. Please use this opportunity. Please avail yourself of that. And now I will hand over to KERSTIN GOTHE. Thank you very much to Mr. Schütte. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, 2.5 intense days is what lies behind us. We are impressed by the richness of your contributions. We have received a lot of information, suggestions in the presentations, and we have a broad overview of church reuse in its different facets. Thank you for all these speakers who took their mission very seriously. We had fruitful and animated discussions during the different sessions, and here we would like to thank the participants from Germany and from other countries from abroad, and who initiated an animated dialogue. We were not sure whether this digital type of conversation would be accepted by you, but the impression is that it was successful. This parallel exchange in many cases broadened the discussion or went into more details. We saved all of these chats, and we would like to make them available to you later. I would like to thank everybody who supported us by moderating different groups. We were unsure whether such a long conference would be possible in the digital space, but we were impressed how many of you stayed with us. We have certainly been able to address more interested parties than with a conference on site. So we had 699 users, and 565 were not present the whole time, of course, but visited the platform. So it's a no-show quote of 19%, which is very favorable. So thank you very much to the Volkswagen Foundation for the generous support of this conference, also through these phases of replanning, of rethinking, and all the difficulties. With such a big digital conference, all of us entered into uncharted territory. Thank you very much to Mareike Rüssmann and the Volkswagen Foundation for the great support in the last 2 years. It was a very close and a very good cooperation. Thank you also to Congressa, to the very professional support of the symposium, which showed us that a complex conference can take place in the digital sphere. The luxury of a simultaneous interpretation, which we did afford, it was worth it, in my view. Thanks to the great work of the team of interpreters. This bilingual discussion was able to take place. A scientifically challenging discussion with experience, practice reports, etc., seems to have been successful. I don't want to summarize the results. I just want to mention a few points which I noticed. Through Paul Post, we got to know the term of recasting. With this, he talked about a specific dynamic, recasting as a flexible process. We saw that the topic of church reuse, so giving church buildings up, is on the agenda of many European countries with more and more urgency. From different perspectives, there were pleas to preserve these church spaces. Theology with its fresh expressions, for example, Baukultur, building culture, neighborhood planning, and monument preservation. So it is not only from the side of the church, maybe that is, it's not only the church who pleads for preserving these church buildings. Then church buildings are open spaces and public spaces, and they should remain public spaces. I thought it was interesting that to the members of other denominations, for example, Muslims, are part of our neighborhood. Why don't we integrate them into reuses? Why don't we give them these buildings if they are urgently seeking these spaces? We have gotten to know tools, for example, the church strategy plan in Belgium of Jan Jaspers, Bishop the administration of the diocese, and other parties agreed on that. We would like to know more about that. We have gotten to know different forms of funding, which were just mentioned. In England, we can see what a trust can contribute to the preservation of churches. The rural area, finally, is worthy of closer focus. We have different problems, different procedures, and different funding models. We understand that at the beginning of a church reuse, we have to have a process which has enough time, has enough stakeholders, and is open, which with an open outcome, and which will, of course, cost money. Reports from the Netherlands and England, your years-long experiences show how important it is to go from a momentary view on projects to a long-term perspective, which in other countries is not that possible. Church reuse are not only related to the local level, but also the national and the supranational level. FRH in this context has a lot of experience, so there could be impulses for European-wide action. That is what I hope. This is how I want to conclude. Of course, there are many other aspects which are maybe worth mentioning, but Johannes already mentioned that. It was very clear that there is a desire to continue this exchange, especially that in this exchange, the higher ups in the church administration are also involved, aside from Pastor Petra Bahr in the Herrenhausen discussion. This level was not represented in our symposium. This level, however, is the one who decides the future of these buildings. So it would be an important step towards transparency and openness of churches towards this topic, and an important step towards talking about a strategic approach. Which management tools do we need? So the discussion is only beginning here. Networks can find each other, can evolve. So this discussion here was supposed to be a framework for that. So in conclusion, I want to wish you a great day. I cannot wish you a good trip back because that's not possible. We hope that you see this conference as enriching as we do. And ultimately, we will hear the bells from the Kornfeldkirche.